It must have been a comforting place because you can hear the water. You can hear the waves hitting up against the shoreline. My family lived here to my left now for many years until they were barred from living here. All of a sudden that attachment to this land is just terminated and they're relocated.
Centralization, a little-known chapter in Canadian history, a story of broken promises and an impact that continues for the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia today.
We did not want to be put on the reserves, but that's how they could control us.
There's a history of failure when you try to relocate populations. You just can't do it.
It was almost like we disappeared. We were like invisible.
Many Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia were relocated under a policy called centralization in the 1940s, believed to be the first social experiment of its kind, one that failed. Traditionally, the Mi'kmaq lived in small tribes or clans, spread throughout the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, the rivers, their highways.
If somebody were to say, okay, where did Mi'kmaq people live in this province? They lived on all major watersheds, all major rivers.
900 archaeological sites in Nova Scotia mapped out by Mi'kmaq ethnologist Roger Lewis.
So much different than what you'd see now if we mapped individual contemporary First Nation communities here in the province. What you'll see are 13 little dots, and this would be an example. This is what we'd see mapping the Mi'kmaq First Nation communities as we know them today.
The story of centralization is a story rooted in colonization.
You see the development of early colonial imperial Indian policy at that time that drastically changed Mi'kmaq way of life.
In the mid-1700s, the Mi'kmaq signed treaties with the British Crown that never ceded or surrendered land. But by the turn of the century, the Mi'kmaq faced disease and displacement as the settler population grew. The Mi'kmaq complained about trespassers, white people who claimed the lands. The Mi'kmaq were viewed as a race of wanderers frequently suffering from want. By 1820, early reserves were set aside.
1821 is a date to remember for Mi'kmaq people. Their social structures, their traditional way of life kind of imploded. But they still had that cultural memory, and it was still important to Mi'kmaq people.
The Mi'kmaq petitioned Queen Victoria, "All these woods once were ours. Pity your poor Indians in Nova Scotia. The white man has taken all that was ours." Indian Commissioner Joe Howe, who would later become a father of Confederation, wrote, "The whole race would be extinct in 40 years. The tribe would be as a dream." Throughout the 19th century, the archival records reveal a shift from complaints about white trespassers to Indian squatters.
But I mean, at that time, Mi'kmaq still practicing traditional life ways, reserve or not. They're still moving about, and we were talking about rivers being their principal highway, but now you see the introduction of the rail here in the province.
The railway, Lewis calls it the new Steel River for the Mi'kmaq. It meant access to markets for work as laborers or to sell crafts. The Mi'kmaq, skilled in woodworking and basketry, adapted their economy once again.
What we're doing, we're coming into what we call our stacks, and in here...
Lewis is a curator here at the Museum of Natural History in Halifax.
This collection of baskets here would come from that period of centralization, and even in the 1800s during that Victorian period.
He says these baskets and storage showcase the Mi'kmaq as artists and entrepreneurs.
Or it illustrates how Indigenous women artists redefine basic Mi'kmaq economy. We often don't talk about this story, about the ability of Mi'kmaq people to adapt. And by that I mean, as, say, their traditional life ways changed, they adapted, but they didn't lose that cultural memory.
In the early 1900s, Indian Affairs put the Mi'kmaq population at around 2,200, with 45 reserves and 19 part-time Indian agents. But many Mi'kmaq camped in or near cities and towns. In 1911, changes to the Indian Act allowed the removal of Indians on reserves in city boundaries. Mi'kmaq in Sydney, Cape Breton were eventually forced to the outskirts in Membertou. And after the Halifax explosion in 1917, Mi'kmaq living in the city were relocated to a reserve 90 kilometers away. The seeds for centralization were planted.
If they centralized them far enough away from the cities or the towns, then they'd be out of sight, out of mind.
Don Julian heads the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. In the 1970s, he worked as a researcher for the Union of Nova Scotia Indians, talking to elders about centralization.
My education about my people came from my people. I didn't get necessarily a degree on how to do research on my people. It came from the voices and questions from my people. I mean, they asked me questions at the same time I was asking them questions, right? They wanted to know why, what happened here, why did this happen?
That's a question Lisa Patterson set out to answer in 1980.
The process of centralization, therefore, is well on its way. It was felt that we would also improve the amenities of the white communities, which are not improved by the immediate presence of isolated groups of Indians.
For her master's thesis, Patterson asked the Union of Nova Scotia Indians what research would be useful.
They were quite quick to tell me that centralization was something that had happened, and they never understood why this relocation scheme was attempted during the Second World War. Essentially, they said, we don't know why the government did this.
There's not a lot written about the history of centralization in Nova Scotia, and most of what is written is based on Patterson's work.
Most of the research for my thesis was original research, primary research.
Patterson scoured the archives in Halifax and Ottawa. Some of the records now are kept here at the Preservation Centre in Gatineau, Quebec. This is where conservation experts work to preserve photographs, documents, and other materials kept in Canada's National Archives, stored in climate-controlled facilities. There are rows of records in the storage vaults, like the RG-10 Indian series, the government's records on its relations with Indigenous nations in Canada.
What was important about doing the research at the archives is that I did look at Indian Affairs headquarters records, but more valuable are the Indian Affairs field records. So essentially, my process was just order any file I could find in a finding aid that said Nova Scotia, from like the First World War to, in the end, about the mid-1960s. And look, which is why I think there's 484 footnotes in my thesis and 161 sources.
1918 marked the start of a series of memos from a timber inspector by the name of H.G. Burry. He would advocate for the policy of concentration of Indians of Nova Scotia. He pointed out most of the reserves were of little value. Centralization would better the conditions for the Mi'kmaq, but the main incentive, to save money.
That was really what instigated the idea in the first place. If you look at the concept in 1918, 1919, at that time it would have saved the department $200 in relief if they moved everybody to 2 or 3 central reserves.
2 decades would pass, the Great Depression, the Dirty 30s. It was during World War II the government turned its attention to the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. And by 1942, centralization was underway. Coming up after the break.
I said somebody talked about with me centralization. We should find out why people move, if they moved, and what happened when they moved.
And we got to the house, and as we got there, we got out of the car, and there was no lights, no bathrooms, just a shell of a house.
And Roger Lewis revisits where his family lived before centralization.
So it's kind of an empty space now. Empty space because there's no one there, but spiritually, emotionally, it's not. But to come back here, the initial time for me was kind of it was an emotional experience because I'm standing someplace where my father, my aunties, my grandmothers, my great-grandparents all lived and had a connection to, right?
The Mi'kmaq in this 1936 film lived near Digby, Nova Scotia. Some are the ancestors of Roger Lewis. They were relocated to the Shubenacadie Reserve during centralization.
As an archaeologist, I always wanted to determine exactly where that site was.
He found it 20 years ago, remnants of a well and middens where the Mi'kmaq dumped garbage, like shells.
Little periwinkle. I found an old bottle, ironically, 1929, stamped on it, the year my father was born here. There'd be little fishing camps all along down through here. So they're still enjoying a traditional lifeway here. But that quickly came to an end in 39, 40s, right, with centralization. And a lot of those old cultural and traditional practices were kind of terminated at that time.
It was almost like we disappeared.
In the 1970s, Don Julian worked for the Union of Nova Scotia Indians and talked to elders about centralization.
I said, what made you move? What was some of the promises that the government gave you? And they mentioned, well, the Indian agents told us that houses will be so complete, all we have to do is turn the key. We have promises for employment.
Jobs, education, houses, and health care. Indian Affairs made promises to entice the Mi'kmaq to move. A plan for 3 reserves turned into just 2, Eskasoni and Shubenacadie, or Sabaganagadi.
The incentives were the promises. The promises were not borne out in reality.
Lisa Patterson says centralization wasn't forced, but only because Indian Affairs was not prepared.
Had they wanted to make everybody move all at once, they would have had to already have houses for them to move into.
The buildings in the archival photos, like the Indian agent's house, were a far cry from the houses for the Mi'kmaq. Shirley Ann Taylor was 4 years old when her family moved to Sabaganagadi, into a house with no electricity, no running water, no insulation.
I remember looking around the house and seeing cracks in the ceiling once we got situated, and we still didn't have the beds. And I would be looking up at the ceiling, and I'd be looking at the stars thinking in the ceiling, and I would say, oh, look, there's stars up there. And then it would rain, and I would yell, hey, Mommy, it's raining. So Mom and Daddy would come upstairs and move our mattresses around so that the rain wouldn't hit us.
The records stored here in the vault at the archives reveal Indian Affairs used its powers of persuasion. If the Mi'kmaq refused to move, they should be enfranchised, losing status and services under the Indian Act. A joint committee on Indian Affairs was told Mi'kmaq houses were demolished, the majority burned. A story echoed by Mi'kmaq elders.
So he said, Indian agent came with a truck. The Indian agent and our CMP officer helped us load on the truck. And he said, my dad looked out the back of the truck as we were leaving, and they burned our house. So that discouraged us from moving back.
What do? They relocate Indian administration offices to these communities. You're under the eye of the master of sorts, right? And it's tenuous at best and not a healthy environment.
In a 1947 newspaper article, the Indian agent calls his office the confessional. References to close supervision come up again and again in the records for the group of Indians we are seeking to rehabilitate.
We did not want to be put on the reserves, but that's how they could control us. We are not animals. We are human beings. They treated us like animals. And like my father said, we were for them. This is a reservation.
Taylor's mother, Roseanne Nevin, was a residential school survivor. She died at age 93. In 2014, she spoke with APTN about her experiences at the Shubenacadie Residential School.
I start crying, I want to go back home.
Nevin's young family lived in the shadow of the residential school during centralization.
When we first got here, I remember the priest came down and 2 representatives from Indian Affairs plus an RCMP. And my mother, she grabbed a hold of there was a stick that round and quite long, and they came along with the chief, and they said to my mother that she would have to give up the kids, and my mother grabbed that long stick, and she said, nobody is taking my kids.
Taylor still hopes to regain the language she lost. Though she avoided the Shubenacadie Residential School, she attended the Indian Day School.
If we spoke the language, they had to wash our mouth out with sunlight soap. So then we didn't speak it anymore because we didn't like the taste and we were scared.
The goal of centralization, like residential and Indian day schools, was to civilize and assimilate the Mi'kmaq, to make them self-supporting. Yet the impact was a sharp rise in welfare rates.
And it was just after during centralization when people began depending on the federal government for a way of life, is when it changed. This is Joe Julian, one of the chiefs that was against centralization, a chief from Millbrook here, and that's his picture right here.
His grandfather, Chief Joseph Julian, he was one of the prominent Mi'kmaq leaders who rallied against centralization.
When you're looking at a lot of Indian Affairs documents, these were the rebels. Like, they didn't want nobody to talk to Joe Julian or Ben Christmas.
Chief Ben Christmas. He called centralization a great instrument to beat the Indians to submission. And it wasn't just the Mi'kmaq who were critical. In her search through archival records, Patterson found a scathing letter written by an Indian agent.
He just ripped a strip off the department saying, you know, you have this 17th century attitude to 20th century problem. He wrote a long 4 or 5 page letter kind of itemizing everything that ensured that centralization would fail. So the conditions weren't there, the support wasn't there, the people weren't there, the materials weren't there. It was doomed from the start.
Despite internal division, Indian Affairs maintained it was a success. Newspaper articles promoted centralization, a model village. By 1949, the policy was quietly abandoned, but the damage was done.
One of the things I always remembered about my parents, when my father came home, carried me upstairs because I was crying so hard. He went downstairs and he put his arms around my mother and he told my mother, "Don't cry, Rosie." And my mother looked at my dad, "Simon, do you think we can do it?" And Dad looks at my mother and said, "Yes, Rosie, we're going to do it." He did it. And I think of that all the time. And seeing my father embracing my mother and giving her a kiss right here on the side and just crying.
Half of the 2,200 Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia would move during centralization. Half of those who moved eventually moved back, but kinship ties, connection to land and livelihoods were all disrupted.
Like I say, they fell into this state of despair and poverty that they haven't recovered from.
So it's kind of a sad end to a legacy that's thousands of years old, right?
When Roger Lewis's family moved to the Shubenacadie Reserve, the impact would ripple through his own life. His mother died when he was young, and he ended up in the residential school and then adopted out to work on a white farm.
It's kind of like being homeless, in a way.
So I often wonder when I look around this town and you look around this basin and, you know, the what ifs, right? What would have been like if they had been allowed to stay here, right?
Next week on A Relocation Experiment, Part 2.
It means a lot to me to even stand here and look at that same spot where the house used to be.
A longing for places Mi'kmaq called home before centralization. And what happened to a fight for compensation?
I mean, you've got day schools now. You had residential schools. Now you have Indian day school. So maybe that's next.